Hey everyone, welcome back to EndasEnglishNotes.com, where today we're going to be looking at In the Waiting Room by Elizabeth Bishop. So a little bit of background on this poem. It's just simply a poem about young Elizabeth Bishop, who as a child went to the dentist with her Aunt Consuela. The poem is essentially about her breakthrough from childhood into the adult world, that realization that she's part of a human race, part of the female race, and just her reaction to it. In some ways, it's an insight into the thoughts of someone who is having a panic attack or is disorientated on the verge of about to faint. Okay, so she has a bit of an epiphany, she has a bit of a realization, and it's how she copes with that, and I suppose how she manages to get through it. Okay, in Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuela to keep her dentist appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. So the imagery there is simply of a waiting room, okay? Now, also important, she's in Massachusetts. Now, one of the poems we did previously was First Death in Nova Scotia. There was a lot of upheaval in her life. She was in Nova Scotia, which was her mother's parents, and after her mother was committed to a mental institution, her father's parents decided they wanted her to come and live in Massachusetts. She didn't like it in Massachusetts, and I suppose maybe that might be one of the reasons for what happens in the poem. Okay, so she's waiting for her aunt in a dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. Now, it might be important here in terms of, you could maybe mention pathetic fallacy. It was winter, dark. It's a dark theme to the poem. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. So just describing what's going on. A very usual waiting room. People, because it's so cold, there's overcoats on. Anyone who has been to the east coast of America will know, especially in the northeast, of very cold winters. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read. There's a sense of pride here that she could read. She's very young, so she could read, and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes, then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Now, that could be a metaphor, okay, for what's about to happen, a volcano erupting. So her mind is going to explode, I suppose, in many ways. If someone tells you something that is completely a complete surprise, somebody would say your mind exploded. And in her case, she's going to have a realization that is going to be like a volcano in many ways. It's going to spill out over. Okay, so it's a good metaphor. Maybe it's the reason it's in there. Okay, but on a literal level, she's just looking at the National Geographic. There is a volcano and it's spilling over. Okay, O. St. Martin Johnson dressed in riding breeches, laced boots and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole. Long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads, wound round and round and round with string. Black naked women with necks wound round and round with wire, like the necks of light bulbs. Now it's simile. She's comparing the necks of the naked women to the necks of light bulbs. So this is all the imagery that she sees in the magazine. Not exactly the imagery that you would associate reading material for, I think, as a 7-year-old. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it straight through. I was too shy to stop. Okay, she was too shy to stop. She felt like she had to keep going. She was compelled to keep reading. I suppose in many ways there are times when we want to look away, but something keeps us watching. Something keeps us from taking our eyes off it. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly from inside came an O of pain. Now, this is the important part of the poem. This is where the epiphany occurs. It was the moment where her aunt said, "Oh," Aunt Consuela's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then, I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. Okay, so for a very young child, it's very unusual to have such strong opinions on, especially adults. She knew she was a foolish, timid woman. So she, I suppose, the young Elizabeth Bishop knows what the difference between what she sees as a strong woman and a foolish, timid woman, and she believes her aunt is a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me. My voice in my mouth Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. So she sees a similarity, or she sees similarities between herself and her aunt in terms of their voice. I suppose the same genetic, they're related, so obviously they may sound alike, but she thought it was her. It wasn't that she sounded like her, but she thought it was her. It was her voice in her mouth. We were falling. Now, anybody, if you speak to anyone who ever has had a panic attack, they will often tell you it's the sensation of falling. Like and if you watch someone, they're off balance, they're disorientated because they feel like they're being hit with maybe a bout of vertigo. Their balance has gone. Falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. So she's trying, this is another coping mechanism she's using. She's staring at the National Geographic, she's reading it, okay? And she's trying to get her mind off it. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. Okay, so again, another coping mechanism. She's telling herself, you're a big girl, you don't have to do this, or you don't have to be scared. In 3 days, you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world. Okay, so she feels like falling. Okay, she feels like she's falling off the edge of the world. Okay, now if you can imagine, it wouldn't be a very nice experience to anyone, but let alone a 6-year-old girl, albeit about to turn 7, but she's feeling like she's falling off the world because of this realization. She's panicking. Her mind is going crazy. Into cold blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. So she's a member of the human race, but I think more importantly, she's a member of the female race, and this is what she sees, and it goes back to the foolish, timid woman. She sees herself as a woman. Okay, it might also go back to the images of the black women with their horrifying breasts as she sees them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. So she's seeing herself differently. She wants to know who she is or what she is. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher. At shadowy grey knees, trousers and skirts and boots, and different pairs of hands lying under the lamp. She's staring at the ground, okay, and the people who are there. She doesn't want to look up to see what she has become. She realises she is one of them. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. So she's basically saying this is the strangest feeling. It's like this awakening to the world that she is a member of the human race, the billions and billions of people. And if you do think about it yourself, that you are one of billions of people, that every morning across the world, billions of people get up and go to work or go to school, and they all lead individual lives. But at the end of the day, when you consider the perspective of one person in a world of 6, 7, whatever billion people there are, it makes it seem that you are very, very small. And that's the kind of epiphany she's having. It's very strange for a young child to have this type of realization, but she's having it nonetheless in the waiting room. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts held us all together and made us all just one. Okay, she says, what brings us all together? What makes us one? Why are we all the same? How? I didn't know any word for it. How unlikely. So she says it's beyond comprehension how we're all one. How different we are, but yet we're all one. How had I come to be here like them? And overhear a cry of pain that could have got louder and worse, but hadn't. Is there a sense there that things can get worse and get louder, and screams can get louder and worse, especially for women? Is this a question about the treatment of women? The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Now that's a metaphor again for a panic attack, of how she's feeling. It's like waves. If you ever think about any time you feel sick, people often describe it as waves of sickness that come over you. In her case, there's black waves hitting her as she feels like she's going under with the weight of this attack that is consuming her mind. Then I was back in it. The war was on, okay? World War One was on at this present time. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts was night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February 1918. Why does she say it was still? Because so much had happened, it felt like years had passed, but it was still the 5th of February. Okay, so that's just simply a story of a young girl and her realization of her place in the world and how overwhelming it is to think about it. Now, you must also think of the title, In the Waiting Room. We wait in waiting rooms for doctors, we wait in dentists. Generally, we're apprehensive as we're in waiting rooms. We're waiting for news of something. And in her case, she was also in the waiting room. It was the waiting room between childhood, okay? Her childhood versus adulthood, okay? So she suddenly had this realization, and I suppose you could say she has entered very, very early in her life into adulthood. So the waiting room represented that crossover. Okay, she finally realized, she came to a realization that she was one of billions of people. She was an Elizabeth. She was a female. And that has had a profound impact on her. So when you go to writing about it, you'll talk about the metaphors, the imagery, perhaps the symbolism of the volcano with the rivulets, it's overspilling. Is that a representative of what's going through her mind at that moment? Okay, so that's a quick revision of In the Waiting Room. For further notes, go to endasEnglishNotes.com. Thank you.